out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, giving you another update for the wildlife. I wanted to talk today, now that spring is getting closer to us, I wanted to talk a little bit about Canada geese. Canada geese are becoming a large problem in many parts of the eastern U.S., but they are beginning to be an issue in some western states and even in the Midwestern states as well. By Midwest, they're already an issue in places like Ohio and Indiana. I'm referring to the true Midwest, which would be Nebraska and states of the central plains. Canada geese, of course, are a very large bird, and they are federally protected, so what can be done with them is limited. Now, you may think, well, they're hunted. Yes, that's certainly true. But those are hunting regulations that occur during the hunting season, and so those numbers are established. But unlike a pigeon or a house sparrow, you just can't go out and whack a Canada goose just because you feel like it. So it has to be done either during the hunting season, which typically is not the time when many people are having trouble with Canada geese, or you have to get a permit. But there are some strategies to handle Canada geese. But before we get too far into the weeds here, I wanted to give a little bit of background on some of their basic biology. First, let's talk about how they're to be named. It's Canada geese, not Canadian geese. I got rebuked on that from one of my employers when I used the word Canadian geese. He said, no, it's Canada geese, and so that's going to be important. Typically, their scientific name is Branta canadensis. That's Branta, Branta canadensis. And there are various subspecies, but most of us are going to be dealing with Canada geese, like the giant variety. So they are a large bird, typically when you get to the ones that we're normally seeing around urban areas. Black and white with some gray. Of course, they have that white throat patch that is they're famous for. They're a very elegant bird, but they are big, 3 to 15 pounds. And they can cause a great deal of challenges for people, not just because they can be noisy. Their feces, of course, the phrase crap through a goose is obviously there for a reason, because geese put out a lot of excrement. There is no doubt about it. So they'll eat a lot of green grass, and then they'll leave you these Tootsie Roll size droppings that come out in various places, and they can be actually a slip hazard when they're on various surfaces. And so people have fallen and slipped on that feces. Now, there is a small concern about disease with those feces. I mean, certainly people that are walking through heavily contaminated areas can have, they'll get it on their shoes and what have you, and that can be a potential problem. But the evidence for actual infections is low. There is some association of large numbers of Canada geese contaminating water, particularly when they're flocking or floating in the areas of the reservoir where the water intake is. That's where it's going out to be consumed by the public. So, but the evidence is weak. You kind of think it makes sense that a lot of Canada geese on your grass and people walking through it and then going home and walking into their house that there's probably a disease issue, and there likely is, but it doesn't seem to have risen to the level where a lot of people have identified it. So I would think that specifically the people with weakened immune systems, and there's a lot more of those than what you realize, they would have an issue. So I guess what the bottom line here, as I'm saying, is yes, poo is bad. Don't touch that. It's one of my pet phrases. But understand we can't really overstate the concern because there doesn't seem to be a significant risk, although we can't say the risk is zero, but certainly it's unsightly, and people have been injured, as I've said earlier, with slipping on the droppings because they can be very, very slippery. There's also another problem with Canada geese that they defecate on your yard. They can be noisy. You can have a lot of feathers around the property. They can also be aggressive. And that is, once they begin nesting, Canada geese defend their nests like their lives depended on it. And I mean, can they take on a human? No. I mean, the reality is if you're having a great fight between a Canada goose and the human's going to win unless they are a total loser, or I don't know, where they can't even fight back. But that doesn't mean that people can't be injured and possibly severely injured from a goose attack. There have been people who have been so frightened by the aggression of a geese. Of course, they're not punching back or kicking it or something, where in their attempt to run away from the geese have actually fallen and broken bones. Particularly elderly people whose bones are more fragile are obviously at a heightened risk of this. And of course, if someone is surprised, they didn't realize that the goose was nesting there and the goose just attacks them, you can get eye poked in the eye, you can get bites, you can get hit with a wing. So it can be quite emotionally traumatic. And then you bring in the whole issue of liability with is the owner of the property liable for this goose attack? And then you start getting into that whole legal realm. And so it's really important for you as a pest controller, wildlife control operator to understand. And sometimes when your client is not quite understanding some of the risks with Canada geese, that you might need to tell them there have been cases where there have been some legal questions involved. And I feel bad for the landowners because they're in a catch-22. Canada geese are protected, but then they're required to sort of remove them because someone might be injured. It can be really difficult for them to sort of navigate this. And then you have the public relations issue because people like Canada geese. And so if they find out that the landowner or the business owner is in the process of getting those geese removed, even if it's a quote-unquote non-lethally, the blowback in that company can be enormous because people aren't rational, right? I mean, so this can be an issue. So it can be sensitive because this is what we call a charismatic megafauna. It's an animal that a lot of people identify with. They like to have them around. They think they're pretty. I think they're pretty, but they often don't recognize the downside of some of these Canada geese, and this can be an issue, right? So understand that those are some of the challenges with Canada geese. Let's talk a little bit about their biology before we get into some other details. So they begin nesting at about age 3. Some will begin nesting at age 2. They often nest within 150 feet of water, but believe it or not, they actually can nest in an elevated position. Now, typically their nests are on the ground, but they have been known to nest in trees, and they've even nested on people's second floor decks and on the roofs of flat buildings. So they're adapting to an urban situation, and if they're getting in large numbers, they will adapt to what they need to do, because if they imprint on an area, if they're born in an area and they're able to imprint on that area, they will return there every year. This is one of the challenges with people. Well, why don't you just pick them up and move them? Well, because it doesn't work if they're not removed at the right time. They have to be removed very early in their lifespan, because once they imprint, they're coming back. Okay, so this is one of the challenges. Plus, Canada geese are getting so numerous in the United States. Where are you going to move them to? So we're running out of places to go on. So this is one of the dirty little secrets that we have in America. So they defend their nests. They mate for life. So the male and female, the goose and the gander, mate for life. And they defend their nest and territory vigorously. Now, in heavy, dense areas, they may only be nesting 6 to 10 feet away from another Canada geese. So you can imagine the critical mass that could take place. They lay eggs. When the female begins laying eggs, she lays one every 1.5 days, and they don't begin to sit on them until all the eggs are laid, so they all will hatch at the same time. The average clutch size, that's how many eggs there would be in one season, would be average would be 5. And so think about the math here, especially in urban areas. If you start seeing 20 pairs of geese, that's 40 geese at 5 young for those pairs. Now you're getting the following year, you're going to be having 100 geese. Now let's say that they have a little bit of mortality, of a 10% mortality. Okay, well then now they're going to have somewhere in the vicinity of 90 geese there next year. And then each following year, they're going to get a little more mature. And so you can imagine that the numbers can escalate very dramatically. And so the research suggests that people don't complain about Canada geese until the number reaches about 60. Once you start hitting 60, then people start realizing that there's an issue. And then it becomes a real problem because people become attached to them. You can't just simply remove one or two, and it becomes much more difficult because, again, in America, our motto is we always wait till there's a crisis before we do anything, right? That's just how we're wired. So this is something you're going to have to understand about your clients. So even if there's not a lot of goose work available in your area right now, it may behoove you to start preparing for that eventuality if you're starting to see increasing numbers. In my area here in Montana, I'm starting to see goose numbers here. And so I'm looking at something in a couple of years that things can get really out of hand here. So something to be thinking about. Around June in the northern areas, the geese begin to molt and they are flightless. And part of that's to coincide with them raising young. And that's going to be important because it eliminates part of some of your control methods, because it doesn't do any good to try to haze them when they're molted because they can't fly. Now, it doesn't mean that none of them are able to fly. Sometimes a bird will be molting at a different time, or maybe all of its primary feathers have not been removed. So it can sometimes be a little bit more mobile than you realize. But by and large, they're grounded. And so you're not going to use a frightening device during that time or when they're raising young, because that's very, very cruel. So don't do it. So what are some control strategies for Canada geese? Well, as we said earlier, they are a protected species. So anything that you're doing has to be of a non-lethal nature unless you have a permit. Now, recently, in the last several years, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has established a program with states that are cooperating, if memory serves, where you can sign up online and get a permit to do what's called egg addling. Now, egg addling is sort of an umbrella phrase that is used for when you are basically destroying the next generation of Canada geese. So what you would do is you would go online to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, get this permit. So everything's done online. Find out if there's any additional restrictions in your particular state. But once you have this permit, you are allowed to find nests in an area, and you would be able to go to those nests and basically either puncture the egg with a needle. That's to prevent that egg from hatching. Or you would use corn oil to oil the egg, and that prevents the gas exchange, because the chick that's growing inside that egg is actually breathing oxygen that's filtering through the eggshell. And by using corn oil, you're actually preventing the exchange of oxygen, so you basically suffocate the embryonic goose in the egg, and you kill it that way. Now, why do you do this rather than just simply removing the eggs? Well, the reason is if you remove the eggs, the female will likely lay another clutch if it's early enough in the season. So this is why you don't do that. Now, what some people have tried to do is they'll take maybe some plastic eggs or something and then and put those in its place. You'll have to read the regulations and see what you're allowed to do. But the goal is if the eggs are destroyed, she may relay, and then you have wasted all of your time. Now, understand it sounds pretty easy to do all this, and it is, but there is some risk involved with doing egg addling. Let's talk about some of that. So understand, when you're coming out to that nest, that's going to be aggressively defended. So you got to make sure you're wearing enough clothes. I would recommend some sort of a jacket, long sleeve shirt. You want to be wearing some sort of safety goggles. You want to have a hat. You want to be sure you're wearing long sleeve pants. What some people even do is they'll carry an umbrella with them so that when the goose attacks, it's hitting the umbrella. Make sure it doesn't have a long point on the end of it. You want to be sure it's a flat umbrella, but that you can guide that goose away. And then what you want to do is think of 2-person teams where one person can occupy some of the adults while the other person's going in to address the nest. You want to work quickly because they're gonna come after you with everything that they've got, because they're a pretty aggressive bird and they are very protective of their nesting areas. Move in, move out, take your records. So what some people sometimes do is they'll addle, if there's 5 eggs, they'll addle 4 of them, leaving 1 intact. So that way there's always going to be at least 1 that's going to come to maturity, because again, if the eggs get all rotten, that's going to be a problem. This is one of the reasons why many people prefer to do the oiling rather than the egg puncturing. Now, if you are going to do an egg puncturing, you want a very thin needle, but a sturdy needle. You're going to need to be wearing gloves because you don't want to get any infections from any type of the bacteria that may be associated with those eggs. I mean, geese are dirty. Let's understand that. And you have a string on it, and you're just going to poke one of the ends of that egg, rattle it around a little bit inside to make sure everything's disturbed. And then you're going to put it back inside of the nest so that it doesn't break. Or you're going to oil it. Some people would like to have a little bowl, and they will have the oil in it, and then they're just going to smear that egg completely with corn oil. It has to be corn oil. It can't be anything else. The permit only allows corn oil. As good as the method as that is, understand that it doesn't do anything to reduce the geese that are present on the location at that moment. So you're going to have to explain to your client that, yeah, we can do some egg addling. It's going to reduce the rate of growth of birds in that area, because the problem is you're not going to find all the geese. Your chances are you're not going to find all the nests. So you're not going to be able to stop the growth. You're just going to slow the growth down. In fact, there was a study in New York where they were doing egg addling, I think it was for 20 years. And they finally got to the place where the population was not, they stopped the increase after 20 years. So they were aggressive in there. But again, that was over a very large area. It wasn't just a pond, which is probably what you're going to be hired for, but it was over a very large area. So you can imagine the amount of work that was involved in doing that. So I'm not trying to throw egg addling under the bus, but you need to be able to explain to your client that egg addling has limits. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be used. It should be used because it does prevent those eggs from maturing into adults over time. So that's one option. Now, what are you going to do about the geese that are presently right there? People need to act quickly, and this is going to be a challenge for you, because if the geese are becoming a problem and you're able to do this before they molt, you're going to be thinking about doing some hazing. Now, hazing can take place a lot of different things. Some people are using remote control boats. Some people are using remote control aircraft. Anything that you're doing there is just to to harass them. Sometimes people have dogs, although it's a little bit more expensive. You need to be doing techniques that doesn't harm the geese but gets them to fly away. Now, when you're doing this, it's important to be sure that you're not near an airport, you're not near a highway, because if you're frightening birds and they fly into the flight path of a plane or they go out onto a highway, you could be creating a hazard for those two, for vehicles hitting birds or for aircraft hitting birds. And so you have to keep that in the back of your mind. Lasers can be effective on hazing geese, particularly at nighttime or in low light periods where you can actually frighten them off a pond at night. Some people like to use more habitat control methods because the fact is geese like water with grass with low slopes, just like us humans do. We like that as well. Well, geese like it. So what you do is you change the character of the pond and the embankment to get rid of that. So one of the ways would be to place large stones along the embankment to make it steep. So it's not just because geese like to be able to swim to the edge and then walk to the shoreline. But with large boulders, it makes that a lot more difficult. Some people will use fencing that could be only 3 or 4 feet tall, and you just put fencing around the waterway. People say, well, how's that going to work? Why doesn't the goose just simply fly over it? They will, but they don't like it. And it really irritates them, and it can be quite annoying. It's sort of like the equivalent of if someone locked the door to your house. Every time you walked through the door, someone locked it behind you. It would really begin to make you angry after a while. Well, the same thing happens with geese. Other things that can be done are putting in large bushes along the shoreline so that geese lack the ability to see straight, clean lines. Areas where they're feeding, you want the grass to grow taller. So you want to cut it at the highest height you can with your lawnmower. You want to be sure that people are not fertilizing grass because fertilizing stimulates more growth. Geese love fertilized grass. There's also certain varieties of grass that they don't like that can be planted. But again, a lot of those things people won't want to use because it's going to take time to implement them. Let me give you an example of some of those grass that geese like. Kentucky bluegrass, brome grasses, new growth on canary grass, colonial bent grass, perennial ryegrass, quackgrass, red fescue. They tend to avoid grasses, mature tall fescue, periwinkle, myrtle, pachysandra, English ivy, hosta, ground junipers. So there are plants that they like and there are plants that they don't like. So you'd want to plant things that they don't like. You'd want to haze them as soon as they begin to start using the area. You need to be sure you prevent people from feeding geese. You would need to put up signs and have it enforced where people are not feeding geese. Finally, we've talked a little bit about frightening. You can use pyrotechnics if you have the permits to use pyrotechnics. You can use flashers. Some people will extend wires across a ponded area to interfere with their flying onto a pond. You would elevate that above the water or even let the cords lie in the water to interfere with them swimming on that place. I knew a colleague, he basically had some of his clients had very small ponds. I think they were probably only a couple of acres maybe. He stretched a large rope across the middle of that pond. And then what he would do is he would go there during the day when the geese were out in the water and then lift that rope up and then slap it on the water to create a big crack. And that would frighten the geese away. So the idea is you're trying to be a bad neighbor to these geese. So there are a lot of things that can be used, but understand there's no silver bullet. The ultimate way, when things get really, really bad, you have to be thinking about lethal control, and that's what we call a goose roundup. When during the flightless season, usually the flightless period when they're molting around June 1st in the northern areas, and it extends on for several weeks, is you basically have like a rodeo and you get a bunch of people and you basically herd the geese using fences into an area, capture them, and then take them away and euthanize them. But that requires permitting And unfortunately, a lot of states have been resistant to implement that policy, even though they can do that with permission from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So put some pressure on your states and say, hey, why don't you allow private applicators to be doing roundups in your state? And we need more pressure to be brought to bear, because geese have really had a pass for a very, very long time. And part of that's because it's a legacy of the time when we didn't have a lot of Canada geese. But we're at a point now where we have a lot of Canada geese that are no longer migrating. They're staying in the location year round. They're not migrating south. They're staying in that urban area all year round. And that is a problem. And so that needs to be addressed, so we maintain the appropriate levels of geese that people will tolerate and are safe for the environment, safe for the community. But we need to have a reasonable control program for Canada geese. I hope this is helpful for you. Let me give you a tip of a publication that's available online for you if you wish to download it. I didn't write it. It's a little dated now. It was published in 1999. But the fundamentals of this document are still valid, although some of the technologies have been improved since then, again, because we're looking at something that's 20 years old. So I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying is that there is additional techniques and the principles that are refinements that have occurred since that time, but the fundamentals are all in this publication. And it's called Managing Canada Geese in Urban Environments, a Technical Guide. The authors are Arthur E. Smith, Scott R. Craven, and Paul D. Curtis. It was published by Cornell Cooperative Extension in 1999, and it's available. It's only 44 pages long, 8.5 by 11. It's illustrated. It's very well written. It's not very technical. It's basically a how-to saying, do this, don't do this, this works, the research shows this. It will go through a variety of techniques for you. It will keep you from making a big mistake and doing something silly, and it will give you a good foundation for doing what's necessary for controlling Canada geese for your clients, who some of them are probably going to be feeling a bit desperate here pretty soon. Of course, always feel free to reach out to me. I love hearing from the Pest Geek world. But that's it for now in terms of Canada geese. Hope you can make some money on them. Hope you do it right, because again, people are watching, and this is one thing where you might get some public relations that you don't want to have. So be careful out there. Be respectful. Do everything by the law. And that should help you be protected. But there's a lot of crazies out there. Just be careful. Be discreet. I'm Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant, giving you information about the wildlife. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.